You know, it's nothing unusual for those at Mountain Creek to have something unusual on Easter Sunday. Because usually a large swath of our congregation is gone to Lads to Leaders. But our children are having to miss Lads to Leaders this year. Some of our children are thinking they're getting to miss Lads to Leaders this year, but it is a loss. But it's something that's, you know, makes Easter a little bit different for us than it is for a lot of the world. A lot of people, and when I was a little kid, you know, I would always get a new suit at Easter. I would always, you know, get new church clothes at Easter because it was the tradition that everybody would dress up, especially for Easter. And that that might not be as strong a tradition today as it was 40 years ago, but it's still there. But the idea of Easter, and then other people, you know, one of the few times a year they go to church at all is on Easter. And the idea is that Easter is when we celebrate the resurrection of Jesus. But the Bible doesn't really picture it that way. The way the Bible pictures it is that we proclaim our faith in the resurrection of Jesus every Sunday. Every Sunday we participate in the Lord's Supper like we did just a few minutes ago. And 1 Corinthians 11, like Mike read, says, as long as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until He comes. By gathering together for worship, by participating in the Lord's Supper, those who are doing it the way God wants it done are saying, I believe that Jesus really died and that Jesus really came out of the grave. That He was literally resurrected from the dead. That's true. I believe it with all my heart that it's true. But I'm going to talk about it realizing that some people don't believe it's true and that some people are not sure whether it's true. But I just want to say this. If it is true, if Jesus literally came back from the dead, it proves that He is God incarnate in flesh. He is God who became a human being. And that doesn't mean that you need to go to church and celebrate His resurrection once a year and celebrate His birth once a year. It means that everything He said and everything He asked you to do has the force of God's instruction behind it. If He was resurrected from the dead, then He is God. And everything He said is the Word of God. And everything He asked for from you is an instruction from God. And what He instructed us to do, what He asked us to do in part, is to proclaim His death every Sunday. He was resurrected on Sunday. And so that's part of what we're doing, is proclaiming His death. But we also want to remember His Word. We also want to remember what He said. And that's why we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 6 this morning. We're going to continue our series in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. Those three chapters contain what, in my opinion, is the most concise statement of Jesus' revolutionary teaching. In teaching people what it looks like to be a follower of God, what it looks like to be a person of faith, a person who lives a spiritual life, a person who lives for God. We started out Matthew chapter 5 with the foundation in the Beatitudes. And the first Beatitude is, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Then we went through a lot of corrections of the law, and then in chapter 6, verses 1 through 18, We talked about religious practices. We talked about giving to the poor. We talked about prayer. We talked about fasting. Last week we talked about fasting. Now in verses 19 through 24, Jesus turns and goes back to perspective. He goes back to how you think. And one of the primary focuses of Jesus' teaching is changing how you think, changing how you look at the world, correcting the vantage point or the viewpoint from which you understand your life, from which we understand what's important in life and what we should be doing. And in verses 19 through 24, Jesus pivots back away from religious practice and back to perspective of life, which you look at as important. Let's begin reading here, Matthew chapter 6, verse 19. Jesus says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in or steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. So then, if your eye is clear, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light that is in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? No one can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will hold to one, he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." Jesus says a lot in these 5 verses. He says a great amount of things. 6 verses. And we've talked about these things fairly recently at Mountain Creek. But they are always a revolutionary change in the perspective of what most people in the world think about as important in life. What most people spend most of their time, most of their energy, most of their effort, most of their creativity pursuing is different than what Jesus says is important right here. First of all, think about treasures on earth. Here in verse 19, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal." The emphasis that Jesus is placing here is on things that degrade, things that are temporary, things that only last a short period of time. He says where moth and rust destroy. The word rust here is actually a word that is normally translated eat. And it's the idea of being consumed. And a lot of the wealth in Jesus' day was kept in agricultural products, in grains and in storage facilities with whatever agriculture product you have. And so if you try to amass that sort of wealth and just keep it for a long period of time, well, bugs and rats and vermin get into it and they start eating it. It decays, it rots, it degrades over time. That's what he's talking about. And he also talks about moths. Another way that people projected wealth, one of the ways that people showed, hey, I'm better than you, is they had nice clothes. They had fancy clothes. They had clothes with special colors because the dyes for special colors were really labor intensive to make. They didn't have the industrial manufacturing capacity that we have today, where we all have multiple sets of clothes in our closets. Even our babies have a closet full of clothes. Not in Jesus' day. But even the rich couldn't keep the moths out of their clothes very well. Even the rich who valued their clothes and loved to project wealth couldn't keep the moths from eating their fancy clothes. Jesus says it's all temporary. You think it has value. You think it has meaning. This reminds us of so many other passages in Scripture, but particularly 1 Timothy 6 has a lot to say about how we look at wealth, what we think about as important. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 7 says, "For we have brought nothing into the world, so we cannot take anything out of it either. If we have food and covering, with these we shall be content. In these trying times, learning to be content has been a trial for a lot of people. Christians and non-believers alike. Verse 9, he says, "But those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare, and many foolish and harmful desires, which plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil, and some by longing for it have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs." The idea that money, the idea that wealth is the goal of life permeates our society. It permeated Jesus' society. It's permeated pretty much every society from there to here and before and will after. Jesus says it's wrong. It's not what's important. It's not what makes you happy. It's not what makes you safe. It's not what makes life pleasing or enjoyable. It's a lie. It's false. Laying up for yourself treasures on earth are not what does it. If you look down in verse 17 of 1 Timothy 6, he says, "Instruct those who are rich in this present world not to be conceited, or to fix their hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. Instruct them to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, storing up for themselves the treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is life indeed." That sounds a lot like what Jesus said in Matthew 6. Store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, storing up for themselves the treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is life indeed. That which is life indeed is not wealth. It's not fancy cars, fancy houses, fancy vacations. It's not having clothes that everybody else looks at and says, "Wow, I want clothes like that." You don't learn that until what, second, third grade now? Where you look at that kid who came to school with a new pair of shoes on and you're like, "Oh, I gotta have those pair of shoes." It starts very early, where we look at other people and we think, "I've got to have that." I heard a TV show on the 10 Commandments this week on one of the cable channels, and they had a famous lawyer from Harvard Law School talking about thou shalt not, it's not thou shalt not covet. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or your neighbor's donkey, and there's like 3 things that you're not supposed to covet, which is the 10th commandment. He says the 10th commandment just doesn't work in our society. Our whole economy, the foundation of our financial world, is built on coveting. It's built on seeing what other people have and wanting the same thing. That's what drives our economy forward. It doesn't work here. It works to make misery. It works to leave people who realize their dreams were not the right ones. That didn't bring them happiness, but brought them misery and destruction. Guarding your heart from looking at other people is a little bit easier now. It's no reason to buy clothes if you're not going anywhere. If you just stay home every day and you see the same people every day, you wear the same clothes every day, nobody even cares. Jesus said, clothes are not what's important. Wealth is not what is important. He says, lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Verse 20, store for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in or steal. Jesus' contrast is, heavenly treasures are not temporary. They never degrade. They never rot. They never get eaten. They never wear out. They never go away. They last for eternity. How do you do that? That's what we really want to talk about. How do I do that? Okay, Jesus, I understand you don't want me to think that money is the most important thing in my life. But I don't have a bank card where I can scan a check in and it gets deposited in an account in heaven. How do I make deposits there? Luke chapter 16. Jesus tells one of his in my opinion, one of his most difficult to interpret parables about an unrighteous steward. And this steward changes the account balances of the debtors of his master, so that when his master throws him out, he'll have friends who will take him in. And it's hard to understand. The master then compliments the steward, compliments the servant, And is Jesus saying we should cheat and defraud and embezzle to make people like us? It's not what he's saying at all. But he does explain it in verse 9 of Luke chapter 16. He says, I say to you, make friends for yourselves by means of the wealth of unrighteousness, so that when it fails, they will receive you into the eternal dwellings. He's saying, use earthly wealth, use earthly money to exert a good influence and build good relationships with other people. Use your earthly blessings to bless other people in a spiritual way. Verse 10, he says, he who is faithful in a very little thing is faithful also in much. And he who is unrighteous in a very little thing is also unrighteous in much. He's not saying to be unfaithful, to be unrighteous, to be deceptive or dishonest. He's saying use your money that's been entrusted to you in a way that's faithful to God, in a way that blesses other people in a spiritual way. Verse 11, therefore, if you have not been faithful in the use of unrighteous wealth, who will entrust the true riches to you? And if you have not been faithful in the use of that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? Jesus is saying, use money in a way that honors God. Proverbs says this explicitly. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 9 says, honor the Lord from your wealth and from the first of all your produce. So your barns will be filled with plenty, and your vats will overflow with new wine. Jesus is saying, everything you have, all of your money, all of your wealth, all of your clothes, whatever you have, it belongs to God. You're a steward, you're a servant who's been entrusted with these things by the Lord of heaven and earth. Use these things for His purposes, for His benefits. Honor God with your wealth, says Proverbs. That's how you store up treasures in heaven. That's how you begin storing up treasures in heaven, looking at your things as things to be used for God's purposes. 2 Corinthians chapter 9 talks about a collection, talks about the church collection, and a very specific church collection, but it makes general application about collections in general. But it's a special collection that's being made to help churches in Judea. And in verse 6, in the specific context of church collections, it says, now this I say, he who sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and he who sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Well, what kind of sowing and reaping is that? Is that a monetary sowing, or is that a spiritual sowing? Is this heavenly sowing? It's heavenly sowing, not earthly sowing, right? He's saying, if you use your money, contributing it to the church, to the work of the church, to the ministries of the church, bountifully, God will bless you bountifully in a spiritual way. Lay up treasures in heaven, giving to other people, helping other people, using your wealth to glorify God, using your wealth to help the church, contributing to the church. Verse 21 of Matthew chapter 6, Jesus says, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. It's interesting when Jesus says, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. It's the same word. It's the root word for what became our word, thesaurus. It's the same word for lay up and treasure. And so it literally could be translated, do not treasure up for yourselves treasures on earth, but treasure up for yourselves treasures in heaven. He says, for where your heart is, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. What he's talking about is value. Back in the 90s, during the presidential election and the next to most recent impeachment, there was a lot of talk about family values. In politics, there's no talk about family values anymore. There used to be quite a bit of talk, and there were arguments on both sides, and my opinion is both arguments were just arguing whichever arguments gave them the most power. But one of the arguments was a person's value system doesn't matter. As long as what he does is helpful for the country, then what he does in his personal life and what he does in his family and how he comports himself, in his personal character, it doesn't matter. Jesus says, what you value, what is important to you, what you put above other things on your list of priorities is extremely important. And the fact of the matter is, you can give lip service. You can say that you put God first. You can say, I'm a Christian and I walk by God's word. But if your activities, if the way you spend your money, if the way you spend your time, if the things that consume your energy are earthly, physical, monetary based, more than they are spiritual based, your heart is laying up treasures on earth, not in laying up treasures on heaven. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Look at where your money is. Look at where your money goes. Look at what you spend your money on. And you'll see what's important to you. You'll see what you treasure, what you value. The next thing Jesus says, verse 22, the eye is the lamp of the body. So then, if your eye is clear, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light that is in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? He says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. That's about value. Now it's about focus. Talking about your eye, he's talking about what you look at. Talking about what you're focused on, what you're trained on. And it's kind of like when you're doing something delicate. When you are, when you're trying to do something, I've been watching this baking show and I see them doing this really intricate icing work. Well, I know that if I'm doing really intricate icing work, well, number one, I know I'm not going to do it because I don't like that kind of frustration. But like if you're playing golf and you're thinking, don't slice it, don't slice it, don't slice it, you're going to slice it. Because what you're focused on, what you're thinking about, that's what you're going to do. That's what you're going to mess up. And if you can focus on doing it right, you're much more likely to do that. You see, the thing about it is, people lie to themselves. People tell themselves, I'm focused on God, but right now I've got to spend 90% of my time and 100% of my money to build my career, or to take care of my family, or to achieve whatever it is they're trying to achieve, which is completely earthly and completely devoid of a spiritual purpose. You see, that's what you're focused on. That's where your eye is. And if that's where your eye is, that's where you're going to go. And if your eye is focused on the wrong thing, if your eye is taking you in the wrong direction, it's darkness. It's destruction. How great is that destruction? The key is focusing on the light of God. Focusing on God's light and God's truth and making everything else a part of that. You can make your career a part of your focus on God. You can make your family, and your family will be much better off if you make your focus on God and your family a part of that focus on God. Same for your recreation. Same for everything. It all makes more sense and goes to a better place. But if your focus is wrong, your values are wrong. If your values are wrong, your focus is wrong. It leads to degradation. So, what do you do about it? How do you change your value system? If you've been focused on the wrong things, if you've been focused on money, if you've been focused on career, if you've been focused on fun and momentary pleasure, well, how do you just change it? There's not a flip. There's not a switch in your brain you can just flip. First of all, be honest with yourself. Stop lying to yourself and stop saying, oh yeah, I'm committed to God, even though you know your calendar and your checkbook says otherwise. If you're not focused on God, number one, admit it to yourself and say, I haven't been doing it right and I need to change. Number two, don't think that you can just decide to change. You've got to change your mind. You've got to change what's in your brain. You've got to change your thoughts. And the way to do that is to do an actual evaluation of what's important. Think like a spreadsheet where you put this stuff on this side and this stuff on this side, and then you compare which one is better. Which one is better? Earthly money or eternal life? Which one would you rather have? You can compare the two. You can ask yourself that. And I'm telling you, I know some people who would cringe and they would say, I don't know for sure. They know for sure, but there's an emotional problem that they have that's tied up with money. They need to be honest with that. They need to spend time literally thinking about it. Which one is more important? Personal position among your peers and how your peers think of you, where you are in the comparison scale of everybody in your circle. Is that important? Is it more important or less important than your connection to God? Would you rather have prominence among your peers or have a connection to God? Ask yourself that. Ask yourself that. Which one has a greater value? Temporary pleasure or avoiding eternal torment? Would you rather have a lot of fun now, a lot of fun for maybe a few decades, and then burn in hell for eons and millennia? Or would you rather make some sacrifices for a few decades, seek a deeper joy, and be in bliss for millennia, forever, without end? It's a literal value comparison system. And that's how I change my mind. That's how I correct my mind. That's how I try to correct my thinking. I hope that it works for you. Then apply the spiritual priorities to every area of your life. To your family, to your work, to your friendships, to recreation. Where does God fit in with this? Where do God's priorities fit into this area of my life? And get that area of your life in line with God's priorities. Because you may not know it. And you may think you can avoid it. But you've got to pick a side. You've got to pick a side. You may think you're not picking a side. That just means you picked the wrong side. Verse 24, Jesus says, no one can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. Lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. That's where they belong. Thank you for listening this morning. If you have any needs that we can assist you with, if you understand God's will for how to receive the forgiveness of sins and are ready to put Christ on in baptism, let us know. We will be glad to assist you with that. If you don't understand and would like to know, let us know that too, and we would be glad to assist. Or whatever other needs you may have. If you need prayers, if you need some sort of assistance, even in these trying times of crisis, we will do everything we can to assist you. We can't do it right here in the same room right now, but we'll find a way. Thank you for listening.